Hey guys, this is Jess. Before we get into today's episode, I need to tell you guys about a great podcast that everyone should be listening to. It's called Behind the Velvet Rope. Now, Behind the Velvet Rope is a Bravo-themed podcast where host David Yontif, friend to many a real housewife, interviews Housewives, Bravo celebrities, and other reality TV talent. If there's one thing David knows about, it is housewives and pop culture. Some of his recent guests have included Perez Hilton, Tamara Judge, Melissa Rivers, Sheena Shea, Jill Zarin, Sutton Strack, Vicky Gunvalson, Brad Goreski, Giselle Bryant, and the list goes on and on and on. Really, David speaks to everyone in the reality TV universe, whether they are currently on a hit show like The Real Housewives of New York or haven't been on your TV screen for years. Gone but not forgotten is his motto. David has a relaxed interview style which makes you feel at ease, but let me tell you, if there's a story to get to the bottom of, he goes there. Just when you think there's a question he may not ask, he asks it. And the crazy thing is, the guests answer. The best thing about the Behind the Velvet Rope podcast, it's 5 days a week. That's right, a new show drops every weekday, Monday through Friday. I don't know how he does it. 5 days a week. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe today to Behind the Velvet Rope on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found, and get ready to have all your Housewives, Bravo, and reality TV dreams come true. Welcome back to Hot Takes and Deep Dives. This is Jess, and this is actually pretty special because I'm here with Jamie Stein. Hey, Jamie.
Hi, Jess. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
You all know Jamie Stein as the empath and intuitive to the Housewives, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
I'll speak for them. Yes, that's how I know him.
And I'm pretty close with Jamie, and we were literally just chatting the other week, like late at night, and he somehow it came up in conversation. He's like, you know that I worked on the editing for The Real World, right? And I was like, excuse me? And I was just sort of confounded by this because I had no idea. I know that your background is in screenwriting and teaching screenwriting, that you then evolved into this business where you really coach and work with people on like a very, personal one-on-one level. But I had no idea that you worked for The Real World. Now, you literally worked in the edit bay. Like I guess we need to start. It's just there's so much to unpack. I literally said to Jamie, like, I could do an entire episode on this. And that's what this is.
Let's get into it.
Let's get into it. So I guess to start, how did you get the job? Like, what was your title? Was it associate editor?
Well, our title in the actual production office was different than the credit they gave us. I believe the credit on the actual show is editorial assistant. I think that's what they called it. We were called loggers. And we did our work in the log pit. So the log pit was literally just this huge, big room in the center of the production offices. And we each had a desk and a computer. And basically, a logger's job was literally to log all the raw footage of the show. So my job was literally being the eyes and ears of the raw footage that got sent to the post-production headquarters from location where they're shooting the show. And then there was a day crew, there were day loggers, and then there were night loggers. I was a night logger. There was kind of a sense of pride, about being a night logger, because we were, it was a little bit wilder because, we're in the production offices, late at night on our own. So it was around the clock job where, you're literally paid to watch these videotapes of what's going on with the raw footage. And then you're literally typing what's happening in the house. And then those logs get sent to the story department, and the story department reads the logs. And it's from those logs that they start pulling, the moments and scenes they want to use to construct the outline of each episode.
Like the storyline.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just sort of jumping into how it all breaks down.
No, this is perfect.
Yeah. So basically, obviously, the story department's aware of what's going on in the house. I mean, it's very much like Big Brother in a sense of they're actually shooting this, for us in real time, and everyone's kind of aware of what's going on. But then they're kind of constructing the show, while it's still shooting. And so, they're aware of the gist of what's going on in the house, and they get their daily, there were two things. They would get the daily director's notes. So the directors would type up notes of what's happening. And then there were actual what they call dailies, like on a fictional film. There's dailies of, they start to process the footage, and the director can sort of watch what they're shooting in an informal way. So every day, someone on the site of production at the end of the day would kind of edit together this rough dailies of just kind of like the gist of what's going on. So the story department knew the gist of what was going on, big picture level. But where the logs came in is we were the ones who were really watching the minutia of everything. And then again, literally typing out what's happening. And then they read those logs like a book or a story. And it's like, okay, so if we know that there's going to be this threesome between, Frank, Trishelle, and Steven, which, of course, we all knew that. It's like we can start to find the beats where like the connections are being made, where, Steven and Frank are talking about, Frank's attraction to Trishelle, and they start to pick those out. And then from those, they would construct an outline of the episode. And then the outline is what would get sent to the editors. And the editors then kind of work their magic of going by the outline, but also I think making their own sort of creative choices and telling the story. So that's how it worked back then. I think it's all different now, by the way. I think the reality TV landscape, I think a lot's changed because, my understanding is that there are no loggers anymore. I think it's a dead job at this point. I think stuff like the Housewives and all sorts of like the candid reality shows that the Real World really paved the way for, I think it really changed how things were run because Housewives is very different than the Real World in the sense the Real World is so centralized. They're in one location pretty much, and they set up these production offices. And I think most people know it's like, if they're in a house living, half the house is the living quarters for the roommate.
Yeah, one floor or in the entire like back of the house would actually be a production house.
Exactly. Whereas with Housewives, there's, they're living in all different homes, they're at different locations. So obviously the mechanics of production with a show like that changes. And I think my understanding is like, shows like that never needed or used loggers. It kind of went straight from like, okay, we're sort of aware of the storylines that are playing out. I don't know the mechanics of how those work. I just know from what I've heard, the Real World now works more in that fashion.
And how did you get this job? Because you something that you also said to me in that like very casual conversation was that it was in this job that you first discovered your gift and your talent to be an empath and be able to like channel people in a way.
Sort of. Yeah. Look, I've always been intuitive and I was aware of being intuitive, but it's not lost on me that I literally had this job that was watching and observing people and reporting about people.
How old were you, by the way, when you started this job?
I want to say like mid-20s. So I would say around 25.
And you worked on 5 seasons, right?
4.
Oh, 4 seasons.
And then I worked on 4 seasons of The Real World. So I worked on the original Vegas, I worked on Paris, the original San Diego, and then Philly. And then I do believe I worked on 1 season of A Simple Life. Like I have a vague recollection of, I think that was the last thing I did before I left.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
That's kind of major.
Season. I guess I never watched A Simple Life, so to me it was just that really was just kind of like a job. Whereas The Real World, I loved working on The Real World. I grew up watching The Real World. I continued to watch it for a long time even after I left. And so I don't know, there was something about being part of The Real World that felt very exciting to me. Part of it was what I'm talking about. There was this real humanitarian aspect to being involved on that show because literally you are watching these people for hours and you do get to know them so well and you see them even though they're like on the set of the show, through the phone calls back home and then like loved ones visiting, seeing them talk to their parents, to their family, to their friends, to their significant others, you really do start to get a sense of who these people are and what makes them tick. And God knows so many of them drove me crazy and, I didn't like a lot of them on a personal level, but still at the end of the day, there was this kind of strange human connection of watching these people and getting to know them and understanding them. And it definitely, for me, there was an early experience of getting information about them. And that actually showed up in my work. And it's funny. If you want like a funny little anecdote about that, I remember when I first got the job, so each season, we would have, the loggers would have a meeting with the head of the story department. She just wanted to kind of let us know what they were looking for. And I just remember the first initial meeting we had, she literally said, don't editorialize, don't comment, like basically don't give your opinion. Like we basically just want the facts. I don't know. I guess I just couldn't resist. So I went into I would interpret their dreams. I truly was, now what I know, I was commenting on it with my intuition and like my perception of what was going on underneath the surface. And it was interesting because I would notice like sometimes people from the story department would kind of like wander in the log pit and they kind of ask me questions about what I was seeing. And at one point they actually called me at my home to see if I wanted to apply for a promotion because they were really into my logs. And what was so funny was that literally the next season, Paris, when we had that first meeting, she literally did an about face and said, you guys should really feel free to like editorialize, like let us know what you're seeing and thinking about them. So I always sort of joked. I felt like while I was there, I changed the face of blogging a little bit.
Amazing. You're very talented.
That's what I like though. That's what made it fun and exciting to me.
So you did this. The office that you were in was in LA, right?
Yeah, it was in Van Nuys. Yeah, deep in the valley.
So, really, let's go through it. I'd love to go through each season and just pick out your memories from working on that season. I guess the first, my first thought is, did you ever get to meet the cast members?
Yeah, well, we went to Vegas for the Vegas wrap party. That was that was unusual because usually, if they're in Paris or, Philadelphia, they're not flying us out to go to the wrap party. But because it was so close and because it was set up at this hotel, the company did this generous thing and basically arranged for like a big company-wide wrap party. So obviously we met the entire cast of Vegas. And then, certain people would sometimes, pop by the production office. I do remember, for example, I don't know why, but for some reason, Landon and Sarah from Philly were wandering around the offices late at night one night, I think while Philly was airing. So that was fun, and then of course they moved to LA. So, I remember running into Steven from Vegas, at like some commercial audition or something. And it is always kind of fun to run into them because what's cool about the job that we had, they don't know us because obviously we're not on site. So they don't talk to the crew, but they form a certain weird connection with them because they see their faces and they're always around. What's cool about meeting us though, it's like they understand we in a lot of ways were the eyes and ears of what happened that season. So I think there is always a sense of like, oh, like you saw everything and then we can really talk about it. And that's happened. I remember running into Simon in West Hollywood from Paris. And I remember just like talking to him for an hour about like, my thoughts on Ace and, what would happen in the house between CT and Leah. It's like we were really quote unquote there in a way. So it's fun to run into them. Oh, how could I forget? I feel like you'll like this. And I did end up going to, what was it? Like at one point there were like real world awards. Do you remember this?
Yes, on MTV, totally.
Yeah. So I ended up becoming friends with one cast member who I won't mention their name just out of respect for their privacy, but we became really good friends. And that cast member brought me to the real world award. So I was there, like everyone was there, right? Like that was like a whole situation.
By the way, how did you get this job? You just applied?
I got it, honestly, I think through alumni connections from my school. So I remember I basically, it's such like a quintessential early 20s LA situation. I had been a personal assistant for a year, working for like this former soap star and her husband who had been like one of the big executive producers of Frasier. And that job, I was like, it was not the right fit. And it left me so kind of like psychically damaged and bruised that I just ended up for like the following year, like filing for unemployment and then doing odd jobs. And I reached a place where I was like, okay, like I got to start working again. And I knew people from the film school where I graduated who were working at the Real World, and they'd mentioned this job like months prior. And I think something kind of like a little seed dropped into my brain when I heard that of like, oh, this might be something I want to sort of keep in the back of my mind. And so, yeah, when the time came, I just sort of made a phone call. I was like, I'm interested in that logging job. And they brought me to the production office. And I think the woman who was doing the hiring was also an alumnus from my school. So that was just kind of like the luck of the draw with connections. And
where did you go to film school?
Wesleyan University.
Oh, nice. And before we jump into, like, I really want to go through, Philly, San Diego, Vegas, of course, and like pull out, your most prominent memories from those seasons. But very quickly before that, you and I are both huge fans of the early days of The Real World. Mm-hmm. What were your formative, seminal seasons or cast members when you were growing up?
This is a good question. Well, I'm a huge San Francisco freak. Like I thought that season, I'd watched New York and LA, and don't get me wrong, I fucking love those seasons, but San Francisco, and part of me feels like a sucker, right? Because it's like, I fell into the trap of, it was a little bit of stunt casting with Puck. Obviously he was sort of cast to cause controversy and trouble, but it worked, and I still to this day remember like the big house sit down where they were like getting to the bottom of kicking Puck out. And I remember, Pedro saying he's going to isolate himself from the house. And then Pam, who's usually so composed, she's like, that choice hurts you, but that choice hurts us too. And she's breaking down in tears. And I was riveted. I was truly riveted. I thought that season was so multifaceted. And San Francisco really kind of has a strong, strong place in my heart. All those early seasons are so good. It's like when I start scanning my brain, I'm like, Miami was great. Hawaii was great. Obviously, it started to change. It started to change, honestly, as early as I think there was an identity crisis around London and Miami because London wasn't as...
It was deemed boring.
Right, exactly. And so then suddenly, and that's the one thing I'll say about that company, having worked there, I do think the company, my personal opinion, kind of suffered from being reactive in that way, like rather than trusting their formula, which had worked so well for several seasons.
What other shows did Bunim Murray produce? They did The Simple Life, right?
Yeah, well, obviously Road Rules and The Challenge. And then they did Simple Life. They do Keeping Up with the Kardashians, I believe.
Yes. All right. So, I actually still have more just generic questions, but I feel like people really want to hear the specifics. So I'll pepper everything in. Let's start. Okay, so Vegas is your first, this is like day one on the job. So you literally had to watch the threesome, like an uncut version.
Yeah, I think honestly, if I recall the threesome, I don't think it was actually a threesome in that hot tub, right? I don't think they actually had sex. I think it was more like they were fooling around. But yeah, the way that it worked is that there were just stacks of tapes, like literally lining shelves. And so you just kind of went, we had a quota. I think at that time they were half-hour tapes. You had to log 5 tapes a night. And you would just go, once you were done with one tape, you'd go grab the next tape. So there was always a bit of like, luck of the draw, kind of which tape you're going to get. Are you going to get a, interesting salacious
Well, because there
tape?
could have been plenty of stuff that's just boring, like dull, that just winds up going nowhere.
Oh, exactly. That's what most of it is. And then as a logger, it's like a little bit of a double-edged sword because those tapes are actually really easy to log. So you could get through them quickly and like be done and go home. But the interesting tapes are harder to log because you're kind of taking account of more information. But at the same time, it's also more interesting to watch.
The Vegas season, in my eyes, that was the turning point for the show. That was when it became, yes, there was always a hot tub and all of that, but like there was some element of drinking and stuff, but once you put a cast in Vegas and you're casting people like Steven and Trishelle, who are just sort of thirsty and fame hungry, and they've been watching The Real World for 10 years, it's going to change.
Yeah, it was a definite turning point. Obviously the show had already kind of gotten away from its like New York, LA, San Francisco roots of people who have if it were up to me, it never would have changed. I loved having people who were local to the city, who actually had aspirations and dreams. Obviously the show had gotten away from that, but Vegas was definitely a huge, that was a huge turning point. I don't know if they planned or expected that. I think there was a little bit of like, just kismet of like who they happen to cast. And
I don't think the location, Vegas.
It was the location, and also it was the byproduct of the fact that by virtue of being in Vegas, they really were stuck in this sort of isolated little pod. And, I don't know how apparent it was from the show that, usually they're in like a big house. That was a small little suite. There wasn't a ton of space. So yeah, they're like stuck in this small loft together. There's nowhere to go. And things got, and you cast a bunch of people who were really willing to quote unquote go there. And, you got what you got.
What was the craziest thing that you had to log, that you witnessed watching these tapes and literally had to like transcribe or log?
It's hard for me to remember because honestly, Vegas was just wild all the time. Like even in the sense of, let's say they're not having threesomes one particular night, that particular cast, their personalities were so colorful and all over the place. It just felt like every tape you got, I remember, actually, now that I'm thinking back, it truly was an eye-opening experience for me. I kind of grew up pretty sheltered, and I tend to be reserved, and I've never been someone who's like out partying. This really was my first exposure to people who were so uninhibited and wild. And I just remember watching these tapes and even the conversations they would have. Like my jaw just being on the floor and I can't even conceive of how these people are behaving on camera. Not even, again, like just sitting around, eating guacamole at the Mexican restaurant. One thing I can say, just because I forget if it was in an actual episode or if it was like some sort of special episode, but I know at one point they did do a segment that like went, or maybe it was on the reunion, that went into like Alton and how just sort of incomprehensible he was when he spoke. He had just had this way of speaking that was like, it was hilarious. I loved getting Alton tapes because I would just be sure to laugh and laugh. But it was just things like that where it's like, I can't even believe what I'm watching, even when they're just sitting there chatting. And, the other thing too is a lot of it just blends together because the thing is you would sort of arrive at the office and it's like, oh, hey, there was a threesome. It's like, okay, let's go watch the dailies. So I would remember seeing the dailies. I do remember logging footage of, the whole fallout from Brynn throwing a fork at Steven. Yes. And they had a whole house meeting about whether or not to like keep her in the house. I remember logging that footage. I'm trying to be sort of respectful to the cast members, but yeah, you obviously see the things that happen at night. There are surveillance cameras and we all see it, they blur things out, but we're watching that. So I saw a lot of that. At a certain point, you do become desensitized to it. So in my mind, it's not shocking anymore. I'm sure maybe when it started, it was
Did it ever feel like watching, my initial thought, I was going to say, did it ever feel like watching porn? But did it ever, I guess the better question is, did it ever feel too voyeuristic?
I don't know if this says something about me, but no. I think part of it, first of all, is the format. So you are watching these kind of grainy spy cams. And I think also at this point, as a fan of the show, I'm used to the aesthetic of the show. So it is kind of like I'm watching just an uncut version of the real world. And then the other thing too is like, they're choosing to do this, and
how long would it take you to get through one tape? Like how many tapes did you have to log so you were doing the night shift? So when did you go into work?
I went into work. We were supposed to be there at 7 p.m. And technically, it's so funny. I still it's like that job. I'm so far away from that job now, and there's still this part of me that's like, am I about to get into trouble? We were technically supposed to stay till 2:30, but none of us did. Basically our quota was 5 tapes. Once you did your 5 tapes, you left. So I remember, but then, it was a fun job though. We'd sit around, we'd talk about the show, we'd talk about what we were watching. So a lot of times you just hang out. I think I would sort of be out of there by 10:30 or 11 every night.
How has this experience working in reality TV, how does that color or impact your view when you're sitting now as a fan of Vanderpump Rules and the Housewives? Do you think oh, I wonder what that person doing that former job? I know that the industry has changed, the mechanics of the industry have changed, but has it changed how you view those shows?
I think if anything, it's made me a little bit more trusting and naive than the average viewer, because this is what I'll say. The real world, when I worked on it, I can't speak for later seasons, the real world was legit. It truly was a docudrama. They did not interfere at all. And, you know, of course, when you tell people you work for the real world, one of the first questions they're always asking is like, how manipulated is it? It's like, it's not. It's not. Even, you know, sometimes, you know, I would read so many conspiracy theories online, and, you know, people will look at the fact that like, yeah, someone's whatever, like, you know, they messed with the timeline. But what you don't understand is they weren't messing with the timeline to create something that didn't exist. They're messing with the timeline because there's something that happened on the show and they want to tell that story. And for whatever reason, they just didn't have that scene that you need to set it up. So, okay, let's just choose this scene from later that can kind of stand in. Now, yeah, if you want to be like a documentarian purist and say that's manipulative, fine. But there really wasn't some calculated plot to misrepresent what was happening. They were really, really serious about not doing that, actually, about really kind of, and I actually have to say, I thought, especially the woman who was the head story editor when I was there, her name was Joyce. I actually thought she did a brilliant job. When I would see how they would distill these sort of sometimes complicated, convoluted stories into these little episodes, I was like, wow, that was really inventive and smart. So I think if anything, to come back to your question, I tend to believe what's in front of me, and I get shocked now when you know evidence comes out of like, oh, they reshot that. I'm like, oh, really? Because I kind of feel like, God, I always don't trust that these people would even be that good of actors to like recreate a scene or something like that. I mean, there are things I know about from Vanderpump Rules that have been recreated, and I'm like, wow, really? Like, I'm surprised. Mm-hmm. So it's made me a little naive, ironically.
Well, I love knowing, and I think I love knowing that. And also, I think it's very obvious, particularly, I mean, the ones that I've studied and rewatched so many times and would like read about, and I have books about and everything, are those first 10 seasons.
Oh, yeah.
Just the look in their eyes. They're not wearing any makeup. They're wearing the same ratty clothes. Like I interviewed Danny from Real World New Orleans, who I know, I remember when that one came out, you texted me, you're like, oh my God, like huge from my childhood.
Oh yeah, he's an icon.
And I mean, truly he's an icon. And I think because he was so raw and honest, and all those people, like Boston is one of my favorite seasons. I think those people really were authentic to who they were.
Yeah. And I think like, you know, somewhat similar to the Housewives, like, I mean, I think even though the show got more convoluted, more contrived in terms of like, okay, you're going to have a job, you know, we're going to set this up, we're going to set that up within the context that they set up, you know, everything was organic and nothing was planned. And like, one thing I will tell you, the one thing I remember, the only thing even remotely like quote unquote set up, I remember there was something around like, they were sort of plotting out how they wanted to do a season finale episode. And I think literally someone from the story department maybe just wanted like footage of the last person, I think it was Mallory in Paris, to like leave the house, to just wander around the house so they could kind of cut together a montage. And the director was literally like, no, I won't tell her to wander around the house. Like, we're not doing that. So, and like literally that was the only thing I ever heard in terms of like a request, and then they wouldn't even do it. So Real World, you know, it truly was in its own way, like a real docudrama where nothing was set up. Their behavior was all their own. And no matter what any cast member says, don't believe it if they try to tell you that like it was the editing.
Let's talk about Paris and San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are your memories? I mean, CT from Paris would go on and do 4,000 years of the challenge, and he's still a reality star. And of course, San Diego, Cameran Eubanks went on to Southern Charm.
Right. Yeah.
So did that surprise you that Cameran went on to another show?
No, I mean, truth be told, I don't know that I've seen a single episode of Southern Charm, so I can't speak to that. But no, I mean, it makes sense to me. It seems on brand. I mean, I remember, you know, Cameran was so young. I believe she was 18 at the time of that show. And I remember just, I mean, she was one of my favorites to watch. Like, she was nice. She was like a decent human being. She was funny. Like, like Brad was absolutely my favorite of that season. Really sweet guy, seemed really soulful, just like a really genuine guy. So, you know, Cameran just seemed, I guess, very much what I perceive of her in terms of my limited exposure to Southern Charm. She just seemed like kind of a nice, witty, spoiled, you know, young woman. But she was witty and she was sassy. And yeah, no, it doesn't surprise me to like hear that she's gone on to other reality TV success in a very kind of, you know, one thing that I remember about Cameran that I appreciated, I think when she went on to do like a challenge, I think she did one challenge, like Boys vs. Girls Volume 2 or something. Mm-hmm. And I do remember that she was sort of like one of the few people who just wasn't into the mechanics of the competition and was kind of just like, this is lame. And I sort of respected that about. I respected Cameron's kind of, she didn't really buy into a lot of the hype, even though she was a part of it and she enjoyed it. So I always kind of liked that about her. So it makes sense to me she'd be like, yeah, on a show where she doesn't really have to do much but sit around and drink juleps and comment on things. You know, it seems very on brand for her.
With San Diego, that was the season where this 22-year-old woman claimed that she was raped in the real world house by a friend of one of the cast members.
Right.
Did you have to watch all of that footage? Like, did you have to go on a special assignment, like, for the police? Because I know that the police got a search warrant and they raided the house. They confiscated the film editing computer, the cast's email computer, all of the videotapes, anything that could be considered evidence in the case. In the end, so much footage had to be edited out of the show. It like never wound up being included because this was a pending case.
No, well, no, actually. So, you know, this was another thing where I saw like a lot of internet theories and whatnot. The truth of the matter is, I think it's okay for me to speak about this. The truth of the matter is there wasn't actually footage of an assault. And by the way, when I say that, I'm not saying that as in it didn't happen. I'm not saying that at all. But to my recollection, first of all, I don't know what's public knowledge and what's not. It was only the two of them in the house at the time. So the rest of the cast wasn't even there. So none of the crew was there. And then I believe like the alleged attack happened in one of like the bathroom stalls where there aren't cameras. And then even like surrounding surveillance cameras, what people have to realize is that those don't roll 24/7.
They don't?
No, they don't. Because otherwise, like, you know, as loggers would be sitting there watching 24/7 a blank space. So the director says like, okay, roll on like Irulan and Alton right now, like in the bed. You know what I mean? So they're truly, I mean, at least unless we were lied to, my understanding was there was no actual footage. I mean, if there were actual footage of it, I'm sure the guy would have been charged.
In the end, there was not enough evidence to warrant any charges. But so why does it say, I mean, it says it's a fact that it says a month of footage from the season ended up on the cutting room floor due to the allegation.
I think that's an exaggeration. I don't know why that would even be the case, because the assault didn't really permeate that much into the house. I mean, it's not like, I would understand if it were a situation like you know what happened on Beverly Hills where the Denise Richards stuff like took over and there was all sorts of drama around like, you know, he said, she said, and it was your friend, but that didn't happen. I mean, I remember, well, I probably shouldn't talk about that. You know, it just didn't happen. I think what they're alluding to is that yes, there was like tapes were confiscated. The authorities did want to look at stuff. My memory of it is it didn't really impact the trajectory of the show in terms of what was going on. If anything, like all that brings to mind is I remember there was this replacement roommate named Charlie after Frankie left. And what was so funny about that, I think he was literally in like 2 or 3 episodes. He actually was there I feel like he was there half the time, but they got like so much story from before his entrance that like he was barely a blip on the radar, but that had nothing to do with the sexual assault.
I totally remember that this guy was only in 3 episodes, but he actually filmed.
And it was so funny.
Months,
I mean, what I remember about that is like, I remember him calling like the production offices like really angry, be like, when am I coming on? And I remember some story around like he met Britney Spears and was bragging that he was on The Real World and she didn't believe him and she like rebuffed him and he was like super pissed. And I remember it just felt like such sweet kind of like, I don't know. He was so kind of hyped up about himself on the show and being on the show. And there was definitely, I think, a little bit of the tail sort of sagging between his legs when he realized that he was barely on. Because, like, I mean, Frankie was that season in a lot of ways.
Talk to me about the Paris season. I mean, from my memory, CT and Simon were the standouts for me. Those are the two who I really yeah. Why? Who would you consider?
Well, I mean, I think it was even a joke at the end. Right? I remember the reunion, them having a whole segment about where's Simon. You know, like Simon was kind of not really a huge part of the house or the social dynamic of the house.
I was just really intrigued by him. I think that was just, maybe that's a me thing.
That was a you thing.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, similarly. I mean, for me, the star of that season was Ace.
Mhm.
I just loved Ace so much. I probably loved him a little too much. I thought he was such a sweetheart. I thought he was so just funny and sweet and sensitive and actually intuitive. And I just had such a crush on him. So for me, that season was I just wanted tapes with Ace, tapes with Ace, tapes with Ace. I mean, if you were to ask me in terms of story, yeah, I think definitely CT was a star of that season. I would say Leah too, at least at first, because I know there was a lot of that conflict between her and CT. Maybe she faded away in the second half, but those are the two who felt like the most visible, provocative cast members. I will say, I personally loved working on Paris. I really, like I said, I had a huge soft spot for Ace. And then, some of them were really fun. Like, so this is something I'll share. Like, some of the people who ended up on the show, they do end up guarding themselves and being guarded and really being concerned about sort of what's going to make it to air and how they're going to be presented. Mallory was another one like that. I think she was really concerned with how she was going to be shown. And I think that's part of why a lot of people didn't take to Paris as much. I think they made that strange choice to have them on the suburbs, kind of on the outside of Paris, which I never understood why they did that. They weren't actually like in the city proper. And then you had kind of like Simon, Mallory, Christina, all of whom were sort of guarded or shut down. And then you kind of had polarizing figures like CT and Leah. And it kind of left Ace there. I think a lot of his unhappiness that season was just the fact that the group was so fractured. And he really had a difficult time, I think, acclimating to the new experience, being out of the country, but also like the group just wasn't having fun. And I think he really came there wanting to have fun and kind of wanting it to be like a raucous family. He would say like, I should have been on Vegas.
Really?
Which that would have been interesting to see him, because to me, Ace is like, even though he's like this, frat boy who likes to drink, his heart was he was just such a sweetheart. It would have been very interesting to see him in Vegas, because don't get me wrong, like Arissa was a total sweetheart. Bryn actually, they had their heart for sure, but that was a tough crew. That was a tough crew.
I want to tell you guys about my experience with wine.com. If you're like me, I find wine or champagne really is the best housewarming or holiday gift, because you can crack it open that night over dinner, or you can save it for the next Housewives premiere, whatever. Did you know that wine.com is just the simplest and easiest way to search for wine? You will not find a broader selection of wine online or in stores, period. You can search by red, white, sparkling, champagne, rosé, you name it, or by region, and they deliver it right to your door. They even have this chat feature where you can chat with a wine expert right on the website if you need guidance on which wine you like best, or if you have any questions. By the way, they also have an app which makes the whole deal even simpler. So if you prefer, just download the wine.com app from the App Store on either Apple or Android, and you can search and buy wine while you're sitting on the couch watching TV. If you want to try it out, just go to wine.com/hot takes and get $50 off your first order. WINE.com/HOTTAKES. So it's wine.com/hot takes and get $50 off your first order. Let's talk about Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Could you have ever predicted how big of a star Karamo would become?
Never in a million years. Like, he truly has changed.
Tell me about that. Like, who was the Karamo you knew back then?
I mean, I think that they presented him pretty accurately on the show. I mean, but I remember, Karamo, they presented him as kind of like he was, definitely a lot more at odds with his identity and coming to terms with his sexuality. And I think that was that interesting season where they had two men who identified as gay.
Yes.
And so they were sort of cast as like two sides of the different spectrum. Like Willie was the flamboyant one, and Karamo was the one who was kind of invested in being masculine. And so I think that he was still grappling with a lot at that point. And I think that he was moody and he had a lot to prove, and he wasn't the best communicator. I mean, he was young. So, what you saw on the show, that was very much who he was in the house. And, he was definitely not easy, I think, to get to know.
Have you read his book by any chance?
No.
It's good.
Yeah. Does he talk about the real world?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He's led a very interesting life.
I mean, I would be interested to know kind of what trajectory kind of led to his, maturing and kind of assimilating the different parts of his identity. Because he definitely is, much, I have to imagine being a father was a huge part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because he didn't have those kids at the time that he was on the show.
Right.
That's the thing. It's like, I think the seasons that really pop are the ones where the casts are, like, for better or for worse, able to kind of coalesce into kind of a unified personality. So I think Vegas did that, even though like they were at odds and, at each other's throats, and it was sort of a tawdry season. There was a way in which they were really in the trenches together. And I think San Diego was the same thing. Like there was a humor that really bound. And even, Frankie, who was difficult at the time, they still cared about her, And I think when you look at Paris and Philly, those are two seasons where the cast just never quite gelled together.
When you think of Hawaii, you feel a personality jump out.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I don't know, it's interesting to think about those earlier seasons. I think maybe as the show became a little bit more or a lot more just like a little tawdry and sensationalized. Mm-hmm. I think you also got more of those people who are drawn to the show because they want the fame and they want the benefits, but are also scared about being on the show. And,
Did you watch the episodes as they aired and keep up with the reaction to everything?
Well, I personally would watch the episodes as they were cut. So I would have seen a whole season by the time it aired. I don't know if I rewatched it on air, but I definitely kept in touch with everything that was being said online. And I loved it. I mean, again, I was a fan of the show, you know what I mean? So, and also, because truthfully, I'm someone, no matter what kind of job I do, I'm going to take a lot of pride in it and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And I did take those logs really seriously. And there were things in the show that I remember this is in there because of, I found some moment that I think a lot of other people might have just skipped over. And
that's actually a great entry to a question I want to ask, which is, if you could point to one season or an episode of a season where you feel that you really made your mark in terms of seeing something and pulling it out and having it infiltrate story.
God, that's a great question. And I don't think I remember anymore. I remember there being episodes where I was like, oh, I really feel like that's in there. The thing of it is, you have to understand, anything like that would be a small moment because they know the broad brushstrokes of what's happening. So it was more about finding these little moments of connection or humanity and really pointing it out. Those were kind of the moments where I'm I really feel like that got pulled because of the way that I logged it. And I have no way of actually knowing that that's true. But, one of the things that you and I talked about is, my early experiences with the real world was for me an early experience of my intuition getting confirmed and me really starting to understand, no, I am getting hits and feelings about people and situations that are actually quite true. So I'm just going to go ahead and trust that, when I had that hit that that scene or that moment's in there because of the way that I logged it, it probably was the case. And it's funny too, because what's occurring to me now as I'm saying this is, I follow some of them on Instagram, and it is kind of cool to see hits that I had about them playing out now years later. So
give me an example.
Yeah, for sure. So for Ace, I did have this sense of him actually being a really spiritual guy. And you have to keep in mind, his archetype on the show was dumb Southern frat boy, who's all about America, and like I said, I just felt such a deep sensitivity in him. And I really felt no, this guy is really soulful and he has such a huge heart. And it's just so funny because now I follow him on Instagram, and he's just discovered this ancient clay on his property that has it's got Native American roots and it's got medicinal properties, and he's posting about it and he wants to make it available to the larger world. And I'm just this is what I'm saying. I saw this in him from the beginning. I knew he wasn't just some stereotypical frat boy who didn't care. I mean, no offense to frat boys, who didn't care. I could feel that heart and that connection to spirit in him. So yeah, it is just kind of cool to see that play out now. And it's kind of like with my clients, like I've been doing this long enough now where it's like I'll have a reading with someone and either I end up working with them on a longer basis or I just, I sort of know them. And you start to see like the things that you saw actually get stepped into. So that's cool with the real world kids for sure. They're not kids anymore. That's the other thing. I was looking at Ace's Instagram and I was like, oh my God, you are a 40-year-old man now. Like I still think of him as that, sweet kid from,
Would you ever like reach out to an Ace? These really were your peers. These were, everyone was really pretty much in your, you guys were all for the most part in your early 20s. Like, would you ever be like, hey, I actually like worked on your season of The Real World?
Maybe. Look, I'll freely admit I am not a stranger to compulsively DMing random, celebrities or students. I actually posted this on my Instagram. One of my like new binges in the pandemic has been Catfish. Like I've binge watched all 8 seasons of Catfish and just love Max Josephs so much and totally compulsively DM'd him about like his intuition and his heart and his sensitivity. So I'm not above a good compulsive DM. I mean, I'm not like in a rush to, but yeah, if I really felt called, if I felt like I had something to say to Ace, like, yeah, why not? I'd DM him. I wouldn't expect to necessarily hear about. The cool thing about him too, though, is there were those DVDs they released after each season of like the shit you never saw.
Yes, I loved those. It's basically their version of Secrets Revealed.
Exactly. And I did edit his little, on that there were like audition casting profiles and I did edit his, like I chose Ace, of course, because he was like my real world boyfriend. And so, actually I did meet him at the Real World Awards and it was like the highlight of my life because he was like a little tipsy and, he was just very friendly and, he's a mischievous, flirty guy. And so that was definitely a high point. But yeah, I don't know. If I felt an impulse and really felt like, okay, I've got something I want to say to Ace, I'd reach out to him. But I'm not like racing to,
Jamie Stein.
Forge the connection.
Any final thoughts? Is there anything that I haven't asked that the people would really want to know? Anything that would just surprise us most to learn?
I think the thing that I always tell people when they're asking about the show that does surprise them, one of the main things people always want to know is like, do they make them look worse than they actually are? And my answer to that is always no. Actually, if someone looks, this is an axiom for the real world. If someone looks bad on the show, you can bet your bottom dollar they were actually much worse, and that the editing is actually protecting them and is not showing you how bad they actually were. And I wonder sometimes if those villains understand like how much they actually got protected. Conversely, though, I think the people who kind of get the short end of the editing stick are actually the people who aren't the villains. So, when you have someone like Arissa or Ace, like those are people, for me anyway, and I think for, from my memory, a large portion of the crew, like those were the people who were like, these are good, nice, sweet, funny people. But like, the fact is what's going to get shown on the show is the behavior that drives stories. So someone like Arissa, who was like an awesome person, she also had a hair trigger temper and she drove a lot of the story around her temper. Ace, same thing, awesome, sweet, funny, kind person. What drove story more was like his, just kind of being xenophobic and, being the fish out of water and not appreciating the experience. And so I feel like that's what ends up on the show. And it's not that it's manipulated. Those parts of their personality existed, but there's not generally a story to be driven by someone's day-to-day, hey, I'm a cool person to hang out with, 90% of the time. So it's actually a little ironic because I feel like the people often who are the most likable are the ones who get the short end of the editing stick, whereas the villains actually get like really protected pretty deeply.
What do you think about Housewives really leaning in to breaking the fourth wall? Do you think
love it.
You love it?
I love it. I love it. I just feel like
can I argue with you on this?
Oh yeah, argue away.
I think it's almost like giving the audience too much candy, and the audience is going to get a toothache, and the tooth is going to fall out.
Do you want to elaborate? I mean, I hear the metaphor, but what does that actually mean?
It's all it does is highlight how none of these scenarios are authentic. I'm very much of the mind like truth is stranger than fiction. And I feel like all the breaking of the fourth wall is just highlighting how it's fiction.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear what you're saying. I mean, all I can do is speak to my viewpoint on it. I mean, I think a few things. One, I still think it's real in the sense, I mean, I haven't watched the full episode yet, but I saw clips of, from the Secrets Revealed of Denise's outburst. And it's like, that's still real. You know what I mean? Denise is having that outburst at dinner and, that's her real behavior and it's her real reaction to these situations. And I think also the second thing I would say is that for me, I already, even if the fourth wall isn't getting broken, I'm still thinking about the construct of the show. I understand that a lot of these arguments are about the politics of fame, the politics of being on the show, the politics of social media. So to me, that's part, in a way, of what I love about the Housewives. It's operating on these different levels, and you get to kind of dismantle it all and still search for sort of what's true underneath all this and what's just the human behavior that's sort of motivating all of this, even if it's being channeled through arguments about dumb meta stuff like fame. So for me, I would rather just acknowledge that this is a big pop culture experiment and, let us peek behind the curtain. I mean, I think it's the natural progression of where we're going with all of this. We are aware we're watching a reality, and especially with Beverly Hills, where you have people like Lisa Rinna who are really producing the show, or even Erica Jane, who's really playing a persona. It's like, all right, this is about the fourth wall, so let's just make it about the fourth wall if this is how it's going to go.
Where do you see it going? How far can they push the fourth wall breaking in a sustainable way?
I think we're probably there. You know what I mean? I don't see it going much. I mean, I want to say this too. I think it's because I've been feeling this throughout the season, just through subtle edits, but I think it's becoming clearer and clearer. I think it's safe to say production really resented Denise this season and did not like her. I think it's safe to say she caused a lot of trouble for production. So, a lot of this stuff, it's kind of like that little Bethany intro at the beginning of New York this season. It just felt like such a little middle finger to her. This felt like a middle finger to Denise. Just kind of like, fuck you, you fucked with us. We're going to kind of hang you out to dry a little bit and show sort of how you really were. And to me, that moment with Garcelle, for example, when the producer was like, well, she stood you up.
Yes.
I didn't really, my first hit on that wasn't like, oh, we're trying to amp up Garcelle. I kind of got it as like, oh, we're including this to really, in a way, editorialize Denise is, not being good even to her closest allies, So, I think it's hard for me to imagine that it's going to go much further. But in terms of where this is all going, what I would like to see, I may have even said this on your podcast before, but I have this vision of one of these shows, a season finishing, the reunion's done. And then of course, in my scenario, it's me facilitating a 5-day workshop where we go all in with the cast, take them to, the deep emotional places, dismantle what happened on the show, really get raw and real and have them work through stuff so that the show actually could become a platform for them of deeper consciousness, healing. Then that could actually impact the next season of the show. If they're actually deepening in their awareness in terms of themselves and their relationships to each other, we actually might get new storylines, you know what I mean? And new friendships. And so, when you ask, this is not quite answering your question, but when you ask me, where do I see this going? I would love for there to be a marriage between kind of the popcorn entertainment sensibility of the women, and these are modern day soap operas, but bringing in maybe a deeper level of consciousness and awareness and actually letting it be a platform for, awareness, emotional awareness.
I would argue Dorinda needs that the most.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And she potentially could be very hard to work with, if she were willing, obviously that'd be one thing, but we all saw at the reunion. With someone like Dorinda, if I were working with Dorinda, it's you would have to slow things down so much because she's so fast and quick to react. And I have to imagine there's something in her that just I'm even feeling it right now. There's something in her that cannot tolerate being in stillness and in slowness. And you see that even just the way that even when she's not angry, she shows up at a situation, she can't stop talking. Luann's very similar. And so I think with her, you really have to, like, if I were working with her in a group, it would be about me and the group supporting her to slow down, even just for 15 minutes, to be still and to feel herself and to feel her body. Hopefully some feelings would start to come up, and hopefully she would feel safe to let them through with the support of the group. But she needs that. Like, she refuses to feel. That's why she's so, like, swept up by this force of anger.
Is that the reason why she was regularly going live on Instagram at like 7 a.m. throughout this season?
I didn't know that, but yeah, she feels very compulsive to me. I think it's very hard for her to sit still. I think it's very hard for her to sit still. I think she's got to keep it moving at all costs. So yeah, that feels like compulsive kind of, addict-esque behavior to me.
I guess since we're on the topic of Housewives, and we'll close this out right after this, how did you land on Leah at the end? Having now seen everything, what is your feeling on Leah going into, like, how do you think, they always say a Housewife's second season is the most telling. You're really, because you're going to see somebody now who has seen themselves on TV and now they're going to start altering their behavior. What do you sense for Leah going into the new season?
I'm actually very intrigued by her second season. I actually think Leah could have a great second season. So for me, for example, like, I kind of knew Brandy. I knew her, like, from Beverly Hills. I knew her luster was going to fade, once she wasn't.
Glanville.
Yeah, it's like once she's not an underdog anymore, like, I knew it was going to be make or break for her. With Leah, the reason why I think it could be really good, I'm really intrigued by her sober journey, which it seems like she's taking seriously. That's a spiritual, 12 steps is a path of spiritual recovery. Just that whole thing of, like, okay, Dorinda's been good to me, so I'm going to totally discount the way that she's been a monster and a nightmare, even to people I consider good friends. And I'm going to kind of align and collude with her because it's more important to me that we're sort of a united front against Ramona than it is to sort of be honest about things. That's the place where Leah could get a little tricky. And since fan response has been good to her, there might be a temptation to kind of, like, feel on her high horse. I'm hoping that the part of her that does desire to be in relationship and to be honest and is on a sober journey will kind of win out, and that instead she's going to be more introspective about what she saw last season. So it could go either way, but I'm really curious to see. And I think this will also be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what it's like for her to not be the new girl, especially if there's a new girl who, like, likewise comes on in a strong, bold way like Leah did. Mm-hmm. That might be very interesting to see how she handles that.
Jamie Stein, you're the greatest.
Oh,
what can we say? You'll be back. You'll be back soon. Where can everybody find you online if they are curious about dipping in with you? If they want to maybe do, I know that you have, like, various offerings. Talk about that. How you work with people.
Yeah, if people are interested, possibly in a reading, go to my website. The URL is hollywoodreadings.com, and you can read about sort of what they entail there, and then you can email me there. And then, yeah, also follow me on Instagram, Jamie Stein, JamiesteIn. There's just a lot of really great content. As you know, I channel the Housewives on there. I have weekly Instagram lives where people can come on with me and ask me intuitive questions.
Those are great. It's like psychic. You call it like psychic time, even though you're not a psychic, but you call it psychic time with Jamie Stein. Yeah, those are great. You split screen with people, and that's like a really easy, totally free way to just sample a little bit of Jamie right at home.
Well, and what I love about it too, it's like, and I always say this on the lives, when people ask questions, they're not just asking questions for themselves, they're actually asking questions for other people, because people will watch it, and I get the DMs, they're like, that really helped me. And so I love that there really is kind of a little community building of people who are, like, following the content. And even the Housewives videos, like, people will write me being like, I really got to download for myself. And the thing that I love, there are truly people who've never booked a session with me who literally just follow that content, and they're like, this has actually had an impact on my life. And, like, they're letting me know the impact it's had on their lives. And so I think that's really cool. So it is kind of a fun, engaging resource if you want to dip your toe in, if you want to see what it's about. And then, of course, if you're looking for more, we can work together privately.
I love it. Guys, you can follow me, JessXNYC. Be sure to follow the show account, Hot Takes Deep Dives, and we'll see Jamie very soon.